It is such a pleasure to see you all here. Thank you so much for being here. I know we have quite a big online audience as well. It's also a great pleasure to welcome Professor Frank Trentmann to Northwestern. He is a professor of history at Birkbeck College, University of London, as well as a professor at the University of Helsinki. His work, broadly conceived, has dealt with a set of transformations that characterize the coming of the modern world, ranging from political to economic to ecological to moral changes. He's written about consumer culture, about trade and globalization, about energy and water, and about consumerism. So just to give you a flavor of his work to date, his first book, Free Trade Nation, Consumption, Civil Society, and Commerce in Modern Britain, really reinvigorated how historians thought about free trade, not as a set of economic ideas, but as a moral passion. Free Trade Nation won the Whitfield Prize given by the Royal Historical Society for the very best book, first book on British history. His second book, the prize-winning blockbuster, Empire of Things, How We Became a World of Consumers, 15th century to the 21st century, has been published as well in a whole set of translations, Russian, German, Turkish, Italian, and in 2 Chinese editions. And the book that we're going to hear about today, Out of the Darkness, The Germans, 1942 to 2022, has already in Europe, where it was published first, garnered a great many honors, including top books of the year by the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Die Zeit, Der Spiegel, and the Daily Telegraph, and as well as a fantastic review last month in the New York Times. Among Frank's many, many honors are the 2017 Humboldt Prize for Research, and last year, the 2023 Bochum Historians Prize. Frank will be joined in conversation by our colleague from the History Department in German Studies, Professor Lauren Stokes. Stokes is a historian of post-war Germany and the world. Her first book, Fear of the Family, Guest Workers and Family Migration in the Federal Republic of Germany, is a thoroughly revisionist account of post-war migration policies and politics. It's an elegant dissection of the logic of West German policymakers as they sought to respond to the seemingly inexhaustible need for labor, both male and female, while figuring out on the fly how to deal with migrants' families. She's currently working on a history of airports in the modern world. So thanks so much to you two for being here. We're really looking forward to the conversation, and thanks again to our audience.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Deborah. And I think we'd love to have you start by just giving a little bit of an overview of Out of the Darkness, The Germans, 1942 to 2022.
Thank you very much, Deborah and Lauren and Northwestern for organizing this event. I promise I won't lecture. We wanted to have an open conversation, which ultimately will bring several of you into it. But I thought it might be useful to give those of you who haven't had a time to look at the book so far, just a brief snapshot of what we're dealing with. So the book is a history of the Germans from 1942, so from the middle of the Second World War, effectively until yesterday. So I was writing the last chapter when Putin attacked Ukraine. So it includes the war in Ukraine in it. And in addition to being a survey of German history, it is called The Germans and not a history of Germany, because I'm centrally concerned with the people who lived in Germany and the way they came to be who they are now. So I'm looking at the challenges arising from the Second World War and how people made sense of them, and then what happened in the course of reconstruction, the division of Germany into separate states, the ultimate reunification, so the fall of the Berlin Wall in 89 and then 1990, the reunification, and how people both played a role, but also came to look at themselves and their country in different ways. And so the central question is, how much did the Germans actually change? People have conceptions about what Germans are like. Some of these, I would say, are stereotypes, but some of them have perhaps a point. And so what I do in the book, in addition to giving a general history of Germany, in the course of research, it became really clear that one way in which Germans are slightly different from other Europeans or other people in the West is that the Second World War and things happening after the Second World War created an intense moralization, by which I mean that all sorts of problems, from health policy to migration, as well as the Holocaust, war and peace, are moralized. And so there are constant questions about good and bad, and people looking at themselves in a mirror. So I'm trying to chart this moral transformation, and I'm trying to assess, how much there has been of a remoralization, but I'm also trying to point out where there are uncomfortable blind spots. And so the book proceeds from war crimes and debates about guilt and shame, to self-pity among the Germans, dealing with German refugees, with foreigners, migrants, asylum seekers, the central role attributed to the family as a caring institution, all the way to the environment. And perhaps I stop there and we'll pick up on some of these points.
Wonderful. Yes. So you mentioned it's one of the first things I noticed about the book was in the title, right? You start in 1942. We're very used to starting in 1945 as a periodization, or even 1949 when the current iteration of the German state was founded. What made you want to start instead in the winter of 1942? And how do you think that decision to start the book in 1942 shaped your writing process?
No, thank you. Yes, I mean, we call 1945 our zero. I mean, that's a common phrase. And the assumption behind there is that societies had a new, fresh start. As I was doing work in the archives, it became very quickly, I became very quickly aware that this doesn't make much sense for several reasons. One is that people take their experience of the war with them into the post-war years. So if you think of people's biography, even though there are some people who try to insist publicly, oh, I'm a new person, it doesn't really make sense. And so one needs to take seriously that we need to know, as author and as readers, where are these people coming from? How did they experience the war? How did they make sense of their own actions and also what happened to them? Second reason is that in the archives, one can see how we're really starting in the winter of 1942, 1943, some Germans, not all, but some Germans start to confront uncomfortable truths and are for the first time asking themselves basic questions such as, is this really a just war? What kind of war is it? Why are we in this war? What for? Does it make sense that our sons and husbands are being sent to the front in this kind of war? And the reason for this soul searching, let's call it that, are two things. One is the defeat at Stalingrad. So that is really sealed in early February 1943, but many families are on tenterhooks from November, December 42 onwards, awaiting news from their sons. And then when the defeat happens, making sense of that is very hard for many families. And the second, on top of that, is that in the spring and summer of 43, ever more relentless aerial bombing. I mean, there's been aerial bombing since the start of the war, but now it really is on a new scale. So this is the Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg and many, many other cities. And the people who are being bombed are, not surprisingly, asking themselves, why are we being bombed? And they're looking for answers. And some people find the answer in, this is just retribution. I think what we know from many scholars already is just how many news of German atrocities on the Eastern Front were seeping back through to the home front. So not everyone knew, but soldiers write in letters, they return from the front telling people, you know, there are thousands of people who had to shovel their own graves and who were executed. More and more stories about the concentration and extermination camps. So the Holocaust, as we now call it, was already happening by then. Many million Jews have been killed, but they acquire new meanings as Germany starts losing battles and they're being bombed, and people, I mean, the war isn't lost in 43, but people are for the first time asking themselves, what if we can't win this war? So that's the background.
I thought it was a very effective choice that really justifies this title, Out of the Darkness, because you start with this really, you know, horrible but really beautifully written chapter about the moral universe of a Wehrmacht soldier, right? What does his moral universe look like in 1942, 1943? And it made a lot of sense to me that you picked 1942 as a place to start because, as you say, people are starting to ask themselves questions about, are we guilty, right? Is there something we have to feel ashamed of in our conduct in this war? And those emotions of guilt and shame kind of transform in various ways over the course of the book. So I'm wondering if you could speak more to the emotions of maybe shame, guilt, and I think self-pity too is really striking at various moments within this.
No, thank you. I mean, the standard answer I think people would give you is, the Germans avoid the discussion of guilt. I think that's wrong. I mean, historically speaking, empirically speaking, that is wrong. So one response, and this is not the majority, but a sizable minority, and their voices are being picked up by the Nazi intelligence services, is a growing number of voices in 43 are saying, who are we to complain about? Look at what Germans did in the East. This is effectively payback, the bombing. So there is that sense, or as people put it in the vocabulary of the time, perhaps we went a little bit too far, they say, with the Jews. So there is a Jewish question, but we overdid it. This is payback for the deportations, and we should have not allowed this to happen. In 1945 then, so the war comes to an end, you have, in the first year, you have lots of public lectures about German guilt. The interesting thing is not guilt for what, and I think people have been for good reasons concerned with that, but who is guilty? And there, even commentators who say, well, all of us, all Germans are guilty. It's not just Hitler and Himmler. When they then try to explain what happened, they're reaching for metaphysical arguments. So they don't give what we today would call a historical or political account. They're saying something's been wrong with modern times in general. So modernity has led to an erosion of humanity and religious sentiment. Demonic forces have started to take over, and they just happen to be in Germany, these demonic forces. And so Hitler is a kind of a demon or demonic representative of Satan. And there's one thing that's now that I'm saying that comes up in my memory is there is discussion about guilt, heated discussion, especially in the Protestant churches. One group says, no, we really have to, if we want to regain credibility, we have to stand up and say, we have been guilty. And there's another faction which says, no, if you do that, you're actually going to drive all the miserable lost souls, our soldiers in POW camps, you're driving those away from the church. So they come up with a compromise. In this heated debate, lots of priests and Christians are writing to their bishops. And there's one priest who says, the Nuremberg war trial, he says, there's so much attention about this Nuremberg war trial. This is really a sideshow. The real culprit is Satan. And you just read this and you think, okay, this is not some rhetorical apologetic move. There are people who really believe this. And what this means, of course, that is in the debate over guilt very quickly, the burden is moved from individual perpetrators or complicit bystanders to these metaphysical forces. So there is discussion of guilt. It then gets overwhelmed by shame. That's much more self-centered. Shame is about feeling exposed, or the Greeks, when they talk about shame, it's being naked to the public. And the shame argument is very interesting because when one reads letters or testimonies from German soldiers who are in POW camps, they don't say, I'm ashamed as a human being, or this is shameful to me as an individual. What they say is, I feel ashamed as a German, that the German nation could do this. Or worse, there's one lieutenant who says, no, he understands people were murdered in Poland. That's sort of one thing. But that we had concentration camps inside Germany, that is shameful. So shame is almost feeling ashamed with regard to some idealized notion of Germany as a nation of culture, so the Kulturnation. So one has this sort of image that they don't see themselves as part of general humanity, and we should be ashamed as human beings, but it's deeply touched or shaped by a nationalist understanding of what is appropriate. Germans should be better. Poles, they might kill themselves, but Germans not. So you have shame starting to gain ground, and then as denazification starts to threaten the livelihoods of many people in the occupied zones, you then have a growing discourse of self-pity. And I think, if I may just say why that's important, sometimes in the historical literature, that this sort of self-pity, discourse of self-pity, like, oh yes, we know foreign countries, bad things happen, but we Germans, it always hits us the worst. It's sort of kind of things people say. It's often been seen as a deflective strategy. Germans have such a bad conscience that they're trying to deflect from what they've done to the Jews by talking about themselves. I actually think this is not right. I mean, both psychologically and empirically. Most Germans remain anti-Semitic. Most of them don't care about Jewish victims and Jewish survivors. They're not on their radar. But we have to remember that you have millions of people who are bombed out. You have 12 million so-called expellees, so German refugees from Central and Eastern Europe. You have people in prisoner of war camps, war veterans returning, war wounded and disabled. So you have millions of these people. And what's going on with self-pity is that this is a kind of competitive victim politics. They all feel they deserve more attention. They feel the occupation policy and all sorts of minimal social policies are not fair. They feel they deserve better. And so what you have is, war widows are making claims knowing, well, there are also these expellees, and then they're also the bombed out. They're all fighting for the same small piece of cake. So it's not really about trying to distract from war victims. It's about staking out your own claims as deserving citizens. So self-pity becomes the dominant motif.
Yes, I mean, you write about those emotions really, really wonderfully in the book. And I find it interesting that you talk about how many people are making sense of their experiences through this almost metaphysical language, right? You said they're not giving the political or historical answers I would expect my students to give today, right? They're pointing to Satan, they're pointing to these kind of much grander narratives of good and evil almost. But they're actually in a situation where political facts are changing quite quickly on the ground, and East Germany and West Germany are going to give very different answers to these questions about which victims get recognition and representation. What's the narrative our new state is going to give about the war? So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the project of including East Germany and the kind of socialist moral universe and its answer to the recent past. How was that a challenge, and how did you meet it?
No, that was sometimes seemed a very steep challenge, I have to say, actually, because in the field of German history, for a very long time, you had a neat divide. There were people working on West Germany, and then there were people working on East Germany, and they did not share or talk much to each other for that matter. Now, in my book, I have three Germanys. I have Nazi Germany, then I have divided Germany, East and West, but I then also have reunifications, the two coming back together. So
Germanys, really.
From the start, I included East Germany, and I had to then make a decision how, in terms of writing, how do you structure this story? And German historians basically have had different solutions to this problem. Some say, well, we really need to be comparative. Everything should be compared, like and like. So basically, for anything you write about West Germany, you then need to have a comparison with East Germany. That didn't strike me as, I mean, there's some merit to that for certain topics. So I do include comparisons of how did West Germany deal with refugees? How did East Germany deal with refugees? What's the life of disabled persons in these two different societies? There are lots of things one can compare, but ultimately, of course, you run against the problem that West Germany, for all its flaws, is a parliamentary democracy, and East Germany is a socialist dictatorship. And these are fundamentally different political systems. So what I do is I have a compromise. I have certain comparisons running through, but then I also have separate chapters. The Stasi, the intelligence service, 100,000 people working for the intelligence service. Well, what are you going to compare that with in West Germany? It just didn't exist to that same degree. How does it play itself out with regards to confronting Nazi crimes and trying to rebuild a new society? Well, they're both differences, but they're also similarities. So the differences is is in the narrative and identity that the two states work with. West Germany sees itself as a legitimate successor state to the German Empire. It's not, the Nazis are gone, but the German state lives on. And that means West Germany takes responsibility for reparations. Now, you can argue they should have done more and so forth, but there is a legal and moral responsibility that's built into West Germany. East Germany sees itself as a clear break with German history that had run before it. So it's a new Germany, the better Germany. And since they're communists and were fighting, seeing themselves as resistance fighters along the Red Army, they don't owe Nazi victims anything. So if you were, say, a German Jew and your property had been taken away and you managed to survive, you would get nothing from East Germany. You had to wait till 1990 to make a legal claim for your property. So what you have is different perspectives on what matters in relation to the Second World War, and that means you have different blind spots. So West Germany virtually has, in its memory politics, has virtually nothing to say about the losses of the Red Army, which were enormous, or the murder of Soviet civilians. That's a footnote. East Germany, by contrast, has virtually nothing to say about Jewish victims. It's about communist victims primarily. This is important because the minute Putin attacked Ukraine, you had very different reactions, east and west of the Elbe, towards Russia, what Russia stands for. So, you have a significant minority in East Germany who hold these ideas of Russia as a liberating, better kind of society, which you don't find west of the Elbe. So this is very important. The one thing I would stress is, because there's been a few years ago some debate where people tried to sort of build up East Germany as having done a really good job with denazification compared to West Germany. You only need to read a little bit in the archives to realize this is not the case. So yes, East Germany cleared out the courts. But if you look in the rest of the state apparatus, police, schools, hospitals, most Nazis continue in their jobs. And East Germany, like West Germany, had sort of popular amnesties in 1948 and 1949 on the more or less exactly the same rationale, which is both sides recognizing 90% or so of the population were supporting the Hitler regime. Well, you can't build a new state with 10% against the 90%. So somehow you need to absorb them.
If I can, since you just brought up the fact that I think you said you were finishing this book in 2022 as Putin launches the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and you note that that had very divergent reactions in the former East and the former West. Another thing that's been very different in the former East and the former West is patterns of voting for the alternative for Germany, the kind of far-right party. And I'm curious, how scared should we be of them, one? And then I think another question here is, we're talking today just as a far-right cabinet has taken power in the Netherlands, right? A different country with a different moral universe of its own. I'm curious, what do you think about the discussion about right-wing populism in Germany? What is specifically explained by German history, and what is maybe just more of a general global story about an attraction to right-wing populism?
No, thank you. It's one of the opportunities, but also challenges for historian. If you're confronted with constantly changing events to forecast what's going to happen. But nonetheless, I think, we historians sit on a wealth of knowledge for us to just chicken out and say, oh no, I just deal with the past. That's a bit lazy. So I do think the history, does not determine the future, but it's good to know that history if you want to assess what might be likely outcomes. So the alternative for Germany, a right-wing populist party with several members by the courts defined as fascist. In the most recent polls stands at 17% on average across Germany as a whole. Now it's already been, sort of a few months ago, it was at 21, 22%. If you then break it down by former West Germany and former East Germany has, in most of the states, it's over 30%. Now, this is important because for constitutional and legal reasons, if you have, as a party, more than, or at least 1/3 of the vote, you can do all sorts of things in state parliament, blocking things, appointing judges, things like that. So the East German situation is particularly crucial because they could, in fact, hijack democracy in a way. Now, why is this just I think the big question is what's so surprising about the German situation? We have populists everywhere, right? We're sitting in the United States. You have populist governments in Hungary. You have the populist party in coalition and various other places. So why should we be, as historians, should we just treat them as representative of some general trend? There are some, obviously, Germany is not on a different planet. So you have certain shared factors like the use of social media, conspiracy theories, that sort of thing. What I think is peculiar to the German situation and pronounced in the East is that after 1990, so after reunification, the West German democratic parties continued to win elections. So they formed the governments. They had the majorities in the various state parliaments, but they never actually put down root as a party in the regional or local political culture. So I remember at one point I thought, oh, it would be interesting to know what are actually membership numbers of parties. Obviously they've gone down like everywhere else. And then I looked at Saxony and Thuringia and I counted, so I found tables. And at one point I thought, somewhere in the table it must say by hundreds or by thousands, but no. It was effectively, in these regions, 15, 18 million inhabitants, the democratic parties, all of them together, have 10,000 members. Tiny. So what happened after 1990 is you have a political vacuum, and then on top, with austerity measures under Merkel, you cut back on democratic spaces, democratic initiatives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a vacuum that can be easily taken over. And then to help the alternative for Germany is you have the human costs of reunification. The Germans now don't like to call it reunification because it suggests there was such a thing. Beyond territorial reunification. So they've opted for transformation, which is sort of, I shake my head, but what they mean by transformation is the world turning upside down for 1/3 or so of the population. You lose your job. You may have to move, or one member of the family moves. The school certificates and other professional accreditations are suddenly not recognized, so you're downgraded. So for 10 years, this was a painful period. The interesting thing is we're 35 years since reunification, but for a sizable group in the population, among East Germans, they feel they're not heard, so Berlin doesn't listen to us. They feel discriminated against. How is it that in all the big corporations in Germany, you have 2 CEOs with an East German background? If we in the Buffett Center were in East Germany, it's more likely that a foreign academic would have been appointed to be director than an East German. So they point to all the football clubs, it's at every level that they feel they've been discriminated against, and the Alternative for Germany explains it to them. So that, I think, is. But what will happen? Well, there are 3 big elections in the autumn, and we'll find out more. But at the moment, I mean, these mass protests against the far right have had a little bit of a dent. I think the one big difference to America is the data we have suggests that a large number of the people who are voters for for populist parties in Germany are voters who change their voting all the time. So they're not yet completely gone off into a separate right-wing milieu. They see themselves more as protest voters, which suggests you can win them back, though not probably with the current government.
I was trying to finish a book introduction about racism and anti-racism in Germany this February, so I feel your pain about events moving too quickly and not being able to quite predict the future. I know you said that that one of the reasons that the Alternative for Germany has been so popular in the East is this sense of a vacuum of representation, right? None of the CEOs are East German. None of the top clubs are East German. So many things. But of course, Angela Merkel is an East German. And of course, the kind of party starts to gain steam while she's in power. So I'm curious about that. And then I'm also curious about Merkel's leadership in general. I found, certainly in the US, we heard a lot about Merkel's leadership during 2015 and the summer of migration. I'm curious about how you kind of understand and situate that event against German history, because I found your account very persuasive, and I'd love to hear more.
I have the highest respect for Angela Merkel, I should say. I mean, personally, I heard her once speak in Berlin, and when you come from England, where we haven't been exactly been blessed with political or informed political leaders, to have someone like Merkel step up to the lectern and give a half an hour informed lecture about climate change. Obviously, she's a trained physician, but with detail, argument, analysis, self-criticism, and so forth was quite something, I thought. But the problem with Angela Merkel, born in Hamburg, so she, but then moved to the East as a young child. The problem really is the kind of leadership she delivered, and that's not entirely her fault, but also how her kind of leadership responded to and encouraged a certain expectation in the German population. So Merkel effectively continued to hold up this illusion to people that leave things to me, I'm professional, I take care of things, you can trust me, and I'll sort out the problems. So after Merkel, when suddenly all these crises are coming together, from inflation to the pandemic, deglobalization, the war in Ukraine, climate crisis, a large segment of the German population have been socialized into assuming oh, we're always going to have a comfortable life and leave it to the Chancellor to sort it out. So shifting it back now towards a greater sense of self-responsibility is a tough one. So I think that's one problem. The other problem is that Merkel tinkered with problems and didn't really get to the root of them, or didn't want to get to the root of them. So you have constant fudges and compromises. So yes, we want to support the European Union policy on climate change, etc. But I have all these car makers, Mercedes, BMW, VW. So let's try and find some special rules on their fuel. Let's keep fossil fuel driven cars on the road. So it's constant sort of fudging. And I think one thing which I think was disastrous really was not her initial call for a welcome policy in 2015 when Germany took in almost 1 million refugees, mainly from Syria, but how then by 2016, 2017, she wanted again to regain voting power by saying, oh, but we're going to deport all sorts of people. And so she built up a kind of policy of humanitarianism, getting civil society, so families, neighborhoods, town councils, to take in an unprecedented number of people and look after them. But then a year later, you say, well, but no, we're going to crack down. This person can't bring their family in. Or no, we're not going to have this person. We're going to just have barriers on them joining the workforce, etc. So within civil society, growing number of people said, "What? First you're asking us to do all of this, and then you as the state turn against us." And that's been very bad because you have, well, you know a lot about migration and refugee policies, but one problem in Germany is you have a constant up and down of pro-migration, anti-migration, which makes it very hard for sort of regular people to come to terms with Germany becoming a more diverse policy. Because one year it's we need more migrants, then the next year is no, let's put them on a plane and move them out. So I think that's where Merkel lacked a clear line and commitment.
I think you're right. I think the account you give in the book really does suggest that there's this kind of waffling quality to her leadership and this kind of up and down and not knowing what to expect. If I can, in your last answer, you stress kind of responsibility, and I think that the book does a great job of kind of thinking about both German sense of responsibility to the outside world, whether that's refugees and migrants, whether that's Ukraine, or other kind of international crises that might need their attention. But then also, I was really moved by the fact that you include a chapter on our most intimate responsibilities. You have a chapter on the role of caregiving and the role of the family in German history and in German's moral universe. Can you talk a little bit more about like why you decided to include a chapter on the role of caregiving and what's distinctive about the way that Germans think about caregiving and have organized their state around it?
No, thank you. We were talking just before, but one of the things that's always baffling to foreigners is that in Germany, adult children have responsibility for their parents, even if they had been treated badly in their own childhood. So, you have court cases where the court says, well, it's terribly sorry that your mother behaved so badly when you were a child and left you with these psychological problems. But nonetheless, it's your mother and she's now in a care home and you better pay the bill because you are the child and you have these duties. I mean, that's sort of stunning to foreigners. So the family is so central in so many areas of German life because it's treated as, I mean, there are all these Christian images of sort of treated as the cell of society. This is where people become socialized into being members of the community. And equally, it is where care and responsibility and duties are learned. So what you have is you don't have a typical welfare state. Americans often look to Europe and say, oh, Britain, Germany, these welfare states, the state does everything. But that's actually not strictly speaking, not true for Germany, because the way the German social market economy works is on the assumption that the family is the first point of call for everything. So you should try to solve things within the family. And it's only if that fails that you can call on the community, and it's only if the community fails that the state comes in. And this sort of arrangement of what's called these circles of care is formalized in the 1950s as West Germany is trying to decide what kind of social security system are we going to have. And both the churches that have hospitals and nurseries and all sorts of things, but also other philanthropic organizations see themselves as sheltering the family from the overreaching arm of the state. So there's a lot of talk about the way the Nazis managed to be in such controlling power is that they eroded the boundaries of the family. They could mobilize children against their parents for National Socialism. So we must protect the family at all costs. And that means that caring for children, caring for the elderly, in the first place, has to happen in the family. This will strengthen the family, and this will strengthen the community. And sounds quite good so far. But the problem, of course, is who does the caring? And that's not equally divided. And it continues to be, up to the present, predominantly wives and daughters who do this. And this has consequences. So, one of the statistics I refer to in the book is that, a couple of years ago, German Ministry for Family Affairs did a sort of study on pension levels in the population, and they noted that the pension benefits accrued by women in 2020, and the gap to those of their husbands is exactly the same gap as it was in the 1960s. So what we have is, we have a population where more and more women work, but if you also have caring responsibilities, it's very hard to be a full-time career professional. So most women in Germany, unlike in Sweden, say, or in France, work part-time. They stop their careers, they look after children and then later on after parents, which means you don't build up a pension, which means when you get old yourself, you are in relative poverty. So this family arrangement has some good sides, but the bad sides built into it. And in that sense, Germany, I think, really remains, in many ways, it's sort of a hybrid. So you have certain things where you think, oh, a bit like the Scandinavian countries. But then it also has things where you think, oh, this could be Sicily. Also, the family in charge, and women expected to do things. And sorry, just one point. This is a huge problem. And I looked this up the other day. This is a huge problem because right now you have 5 million people in Germany, population of 85 million, 5 million people needing care. In 10 years, this number is said to be at 8 or 9 million. At the same time, you have a demographic decline, so fewer children coming through the system. So the experts estimate that if just for Germany to keep its current population of people in employment, you would need every year 500,000 new migrants. So you have these tensions. You don't want migrants, but you want you want to solve the care crisis, and you can't have both.
No, thank you for that. That's a really fascinating fascinating bit of the German moral universe that I don't think foreigners think about that much and are kind of shocked to be confronted with some of the facts of it. I think we're going to turn over to audience questions in a second, but I did want to make sure before we did that I also asked about, I started with 1942, so I'll finish by asking about 2022. You mentioned that you were finishing this book up as the Russia-Ukraine war was beginning, and your epilogue, you title it, "What is Germany for?" which I thought was a great title. I think you've shown that it's a thing you can write a very good book about. But this question of what is Germany for has often asserted itself in questions of should Germany engage militarily abroad. That's true in Iraq, that was true in Afghanistan, and currently there's a big debate about what Germany ought to do for Ukraine. So can you speak a little bit to that circle of responsibility? Germany perhaps in the world, Germany's, if we start with Germany in 1942 and World War II, what's Germany's role in 2022 in the conflicts of our day and age?
Yeah. Here I can have a local anecdote, because as I was walking around Evanston, I come through this little plaza which has a wall, a sort of glass wall, honoring American soldiers who've died in various wars. And then there's a quote from Eisenhower on the importance of that. That is something you will not find in Germany. There are many, many monuments, but the monuments are to the victims of various German armies. You don't really find that. So one problem Germany is facing is that the idea not just of military service, but the duty to defend your country is deeply alien to many people. So this is a tall order. You have probably the only politician who has high opinion ratings in Germany is the recently appointed Minister of Defense. And he openly talks of making Germany ready for war. But he got huge criticism. How can you use that term, being ready for war? I mean, he said, well, that's what armies are for. But that's alien to many Germans, certainly in my generation, where you had this idea of Germany as a power of peace, a Friedensmacht. So the idea of military involvement, and even when it came to military involvements in Afghanistan, it's a mess because they're not equipped really to fight, so they're relying on American troops. And when things go wrong, it's a huge political crisis. So I think for Germany I do believe personally that Germany needs to confront the possibility that Ukraine may not be the last war. Certainly if you were in the Baltic states or in Poland, you would react very differently. The other problem is that the population is really divided on this question, and the current chancellor has, in that regard, this woolly. You said Merkel was sort of muddling through and woolly-minded. I mean, people people coined a new German verb after Merkel. They said that she Merkeln, that's what Stalin did. And Scholz, the new chancellor, does a little bit of that zigzagging when it comes to how much support exactly, what kind of weapons Ukraine can have, but which ones they can't have. And it's a long back and forth. And that's partly, I think, the zigzagging is politicians very aware that society is split on this issue. So they're trying to somehow reconcile these positions. I think the situation in the Middle East is, I mean, for all sorts of reasons, it's very disturbing. But from the German point of view, you have the problem that official policy has been to define the security and defense of Israel as a state, as part of the German state, the reason of the German state. But it has been interpreted fairly narrowly as supporting whatever Netanyahu does. So support of policy, not just support of the state. And I think as the war has gone on, you have more and more popular frustration and doubts about German official policies. So in addition to having a split society, we face the scenario that the official policy is increasingly alienating public opinion. This is problematic, I would say, because you have, and I trace this in the book, you have attempts again and again and again to commit Germany to the defense of human rights internationally, for Germans to have less self-pity and to learn to have empathy towards victims and the poor in other parts of the world. So you see that in the current debate. But at the same time, you have a parochialism or insularism. So in the polls we have on the Middle East, a very sizable number of people say, well, what has this got to do with me? I just want my little house and my garden. And this Middle East, I don't have anything to do with it. So there continues to be the problem that many Germans don't see themselves as part of global relations. They have this idea they can be inward looking, shut the door and keep global problems out. And I think in our current situation, that's going to be much, much harder than it was, say, in the 80s or 90s.
Thank you. I can ask more questions, but we can also take, I think, from the audience.
You talked about guilt. What do you think about the guilt of the parties to the Treaty of Versailles? They created this problem.
No, that is what you say is what many Germans in 45, 46 said. And as a sort of interpretation, that is important because people really believed it. And it's of course, but it is something, it's an interpretation that was cultivated in the 20s and 30s by nationalist and then by fascist groups. So I don't think, obviously the War of Versailles produces all sorts of dissensions, frictions and tensions, economic problems, political problems, but it's not the cause, I would say, of a war of extermination and the Holocaust. So we can't pin it on Versailles. But the one thing I would add about Versailles, which is interesting and goes all the way to the present, it's very interesting how this narrative or motif of victimhood, Germans are victims. This peace is imposed on us and we're the victims of the peace, has sort of similar has sort of echoes in the way East Germans talk about 1919 reunification. We are victims of this arrangement that was imposed on us. So I think Versailles isn't just an interwar sentiment, if you want. It continues to run. But Versailles did not, in itself, cause the Nazis or the Second World War, I wouldn't say.
Certainly gave them opportunity. The Weimar Republic was very difficult.
This makes me nostalgic. My Dr. Vater, my professor, in his first book, which is very big and with in small print, the whole book is actually a mass of evidence on how Weimar, after hyperinflation in 1923, managed to gain remarkable stability in the middle of the 1920s. So Weimar wasn't, the failure of Weimar wasn't a foregone conclusion. Their political forces and economic interests, old elites, new elites, who had an interest in destabilizing Weimar during the world recession. So lots of contingencies and factors coming together.
Hi, I'm a student at Northwestern. I just did a project about the post-war expulsions of Germany, or of the Germans, and I was wondering, like, you look at Israel-Palestine now, you have Palestinians who 75 years later are still trying to come back, but just 40 years after the post-war expulsions, there's no movement for the Volksdeutsche to return to like Czechoslovakia or Poland. So my question is like, why do you think that is? Why has there been no like movement for them to go back to their homelands after the Iron Curtain fell?
Well, two points. One is on your comparison to the situation in Palestine. One thing that's very interesting, looking at the Vertriebene, the refugees, the expellees in the post-war years, is when their politics and their own suffering and claims to the homeland, when that gets connected to national, international political developments, and when it drops out. So in the late 70s, the boat people, some of you will remember the boat people, so Vietnamese boat people who become refugees, the expellees come to the fore and say, their fate is exactly like ours. We've been there. Let's mobilize to help them. And suddenly you have lots of books about the expulsions from Germany. In the Middle East conflict right now, you might logically think, well, there's bombing, there's displacement, expulsions, exactly, as you say, exactly like that. I've not seen any reference to the expulsions at the end and after the Second World War in Germany. These two topics don't fit, and so they're suppressed. Now, to your main question, why is there not more agitation to return? Well, East Germany is now part of the communist bloc. So East Germany defines these people not as refugees or expellees, they actually call them new citizens. And they make sure that they don't organize because ultimately it's fellow communist countries that had driven them out, so you don't want to do anything. West Germany, for a long time, until the early 70s, West German politicians keep up the hope that they might return. So, you have these mass gatherings, hundreds of thousands of people coming together, the Sudeten Germans or the people from Silesia, and you have Adenauer, Chancellor, but also Social Democrats deliver speeches saying this was an injustice. We hope that in your own lifetime you will be able to return to your homeland. That's what they say to the expellees. internationally, they don't do very much at all because they know this is, runs counter to your diplomatic interests. So it depends on, I suppose, your psychology, which is better. If you're an expellee in East Germany, you're given the blunt truth. You're not going to return. Forget it. And it doesn't happen. In West Germany, they keep up this illusion. So people move into a kind of politics of nostalgia where they keep alive the idea of the homeland, and that at some point they will eventually return, for which they have to wait until 1990. And you have lots of charter tour groups sort of going back, but it doesn't happen. So I'm sort of divided, actually, personally, what's better. And, should you be given the blunt truth, or should you be able to hold on to this longing for the homeland? But the important thing is, I think, looking at it comparatively and internationally, you have 12 million people who feel they've been expelled from their farmstead or their town against their will. Lots of people dying on the way. So you have potentially a tremendous source for revenge, and a sense of, we will go back one way or another. And I think it's one of the remarkable accomplishments of post-war Germany that this potential for revenge and aggression gets transformed into a more constructive energy, and that's the economic boom. So, the minute you have economic reconstruction, this is a way to integrate people. Work integrates them into companies. They build their new homes, and so they hold on. They may have photos of their old homestead, but they remarry into families of old citizens. And so economic reconstruction really diverted these more nasty energies into more constructive ones.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask a question about the timeline for the book. You discussed earlier, starting in 1942, is kind of this turning point in the war where it seems like a German loss is possible, and how the extent to which this is or is not the start of a moral transformation for Germany at large. To what extent do you think, if there was a moral adjustment here, it had a self-preservationist bent to it? Like, we might lose this war, the Soviets are a couple years out from coming to get us, and if we don't begin to repent, so to speak, we're going to face the wrath of the entire world more than we already are. Would this sentiment, do you think there's genuineness in this sense? Or is it more of I guess, kind of a circumstantial way to save, I guess, Germany's moral skin, so to speak?
No, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of it is about saving their own skins, but it has, or in addition, it does other things to people's sense of themselves and their psychology than being manipulative in that sense. So I give just one example. There's a school teacher in northern Germany who in 1939, 40, 41, beginning of 42, is an ardent supporter of the war. He keeps an extensive diary. He said, Hitler, how wonderful. The greatest statesman, the greatest leader of German history, indeed world history. How lucky we are. We're winning. Of course we're winning. Writes letters. He volunteers to write secret reports for the Nazi intelligence service on what other teachers and students and neighbors say. So, it's fully signed on. He, in 42, former pupils come back who did sort of war service in the East, who mention atrocities. He just sort of, in a few words, he noticed that, not much, no, but his son is then moved out to the Eastern Front and fights at Stalingrad, and then is, lost missing in quotation marks. He doesn't know what happened. From that moment on, the diary changes course. So suddenly you have March, April 1943, listening to speeches by Goebbels or Hitler. He says, well, I'm actually no longer sure. Who's the greater evil in this world? Is it really Stalin or perhaps Hitler? So he starts asking himself these questions. He then decides, I'm not going to wear my party badge anymore. Then he says, I'm not going to put out the swastika anymore at various public events until my son is back home, which doesn't happen. He then says, I'm also refusing to I'm no longer going to write reports here on what's being said. His wife starts going around in the neighborhood shouting sort of blasphemies about the local Nazi leaders as having a cushy life while the sons die on the Eastern Front. He has to sort of hush up. By early 1945, this same man, who would 5 years earlier be an ardent supporter of the German war effort, had convinced himself that he never really believed in this war in the first place. He was always skeptical about some of the measures against the Jews. And this comes out as if it's a natural reflection. So yes, many Germans were very worried. What's going to happen if the war is lost, being held to account? But it's not sort of an instant thought. I think it triggers then a reimagining of people's past to make sense with the new present. And I think that's important because it means that people like this teacher in 45 can make the transition into life and a society after the Nazis. I mean, they've convinced themselves that they've never been really Nazis. Makes it easier to adjust. And I think if that hadn't happened, you would have had a very different constellation in 45 and 46. And we would have seen a much, much, much more difficult and potentially explosive transition into post-war society. So you're absolutely right. But I think we need to take into account the sort of psychological remaking that people go through. Not all, I should always say. He's not representative, but there are many cases like that.
Thank you for asking or for bringing up the psychological aspects. And I do want to ask about those in connection to what you brought up earlier, the various challenges within Germany to accepting that it is becoming and has already been a more diverse polity. Do you think that an institutionalized Erinnerungskultur or a kind of an assumption that the past has been worked through can in fact be a barrier to that diversification if the ethnic or if the identity of Täternation is so institutionalized that it must therefore exclude and ignore die Opfer der Nation, whether that is descendants of German colonialism in Africa or the German Jews and German Palestinians currently being beaten and arrested in the streets of Berlin?
No, thank you very much. I mean, the context is there is right now a lot of debate about a official review of memorialization and memory politics in Germany, which is about what should be included, how should it be included? So in addition to the Holocaust, how to give greater attention to Germany's colonialism and the crimes and genocide there, but also to give more attention to the experience of migrants who now live in Germany. So that's the debate. To your question, I mean, the thing that really, the first thing that struck me, I should say, I wrote this in English because that's how I work, and I wrote it for British and American audiences, but also for a German audience. And so the book came out simultaneously in Germany. So I was in Germany in October, November, and was immediately struck by the fixation on memory politics. So many people just wanted to talk to me as if I'd written a book on memory politics. And I had to sort of make the point eventually that, well, memory is very good and memory politics can do lots of things, but memory is not the same as action or action in daily life, in political behavior. So many German commentators were stunned and speechless that after the massacres by Hamas on 7th October, you simultaneously in Germany had a steep rise of anti-Semitic attacks and virtual silence in the rest of the population. So in large cities, you may have had 50 or 80 people who came out to show their support for the families of murdered or kidnapped people. People said, what's happening in Germany? We have all this memory politics, and now, and I said, well, the one doesn't translate into the other. That's, I think, the first thing I would say. I mean, you rightly said whether memory politics, once it's so institutionalized, and perhaps we should add ritualized, does a lot. So we have studies from anthropologists who've observed school classes who go on the routine visit to concentration camp or other memorial sites. And one thing these ethnographic investigations bring out is the, well, let's call it ethno-nationalist and paternalistic way in which memory politics has been used. So Germans finally, privately and publicly acknowledged the historical responsibility for the crimes, for the murder of the Jews and a war of extermination. But initially that meant ethnic Germans standing up for what their parents or grandparents had done. In the course of the 60s, 70s, and 1960s and 70s and so forth, Germany is becoming a much more diverse society with millions of migrants who by now are third generation in many sense. Well, their grandparents hadn't been murdering Jews on the Eastern Front. They're living in Germany. They expected to subscribe and support this notion of historic responsibility. But it's often, according to these ethnographic accounts, it's often done in a way that, well, you might not have, your parents might not have been born here, but let us tell you, now that you're in Germany, this is how you should talk about it. And the problem starts with the fact that some of these migrant groups are have either themselves had experiences of war or being a refugee, or in their families, they may have, so Lebanese, for instance, people, or in the case of many Turkish Germans, they've been exposed to discrimination, xenophobia, and so forth. So they have reasonable grounds to be worried about racism. But the minute they say that, they're often then put into their place, saying, well, now you're not going to put yourself in the same position as the victims of the Holocaust, are you? It's the kind of response they get. So memory politics has actually sometimes created new divisions, I would say, in society. So that now the government is keen to acknowledge, well, the colonial crimes had been acknowledged publicly, but keen to include colonialism in this is, I think, my personal view is overdue. The challenge is to contextualize it. And so I think that's where the heated debate is, that some people worry that if done badly, the Holocaust might actually end up being relativized. Just one of many other crimes in the history of Western imperialism, kind of thing. And there are some people who see it that way, but I don't think that's necessary. I mean, I do think both in terms of what historians, the research historians have done on colonial violence and its relation to the Second World War and to Nazi violence, you can contextualize it and you can compare without equating the two. But one thing popped into my head, which I think is illustrative of the dramatic change in how Germans, or what Germans remember of the past. In 1999, the then Foreign Secretary, Joschka Fischer, a Green politician who supported intervention in the Kosovo War, 1999, he gave a public speech explaining the principles of German foreign policy as he understood it. And he said, well, he has he will continue in the path of his predecessors. What he called the European preference is central to German foreign policy, he said, because of Germany's history. Because Germany, he said, was never a maritime or a colonial power. You know, that's the foreign secretary who's a learned man. So either that means, well, you just think these colonies didn't matter that much, or perhaps they didn't exist. I think now, if you said that now, as a politician, you would lose your job. So there is more awareness, but it's come very late, very late.
Going back to 1945, I think it is when Philip Sand introduced the notion of genocide. Okay, this was the first time, right? It was recognized. What impact did it have, in Germany, like at the beginning and later on?
And when you say later on, you mean to the present, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is, of course, a very, very thorny issue in the German debate. What's included in genocide and what is not. And unlike Sands, I'm not a lawyer, so the first thing I would always say is, well, it doesn't really matter what a historian thinks on these questions. These are the international conventions on genocide, and they're, of course, currently ongoing legal debates about what is happening in the Middle East and how to qualify it. What I would say, though, because sometimes I sense in the foreign media, the current German debate about the Middle East is sort of shoehorned into an account where the focus on the Holocaust in memory politics is so central that it suggests, oh, because of that, the Germans have difficulty seeing other genocides. I think that's wrong. And to support this, you can, for instance, look at the Armenian genocide. That's not only been recognized by German parliament and government as a genocide, but in fact, it was a refugee in Germany who was working in Germany with the whole memory politics in the back of his mind to raise awareness of this. And similarly, the murder of the Herero and Nama is recognized as a genocide. So whatever we think about the Middle East, it's not the case that the Holocaust has prevented German politicians or writers from not recognizing other genocides and war crimes. That's what I would say. Middle East is a different, would be a bigger discussion.
Thank you so much, the two of you, for a really excellent conversation. We have a reception outside, so please join us and for more conversation, and let us give you a round of applause. Thank you. And I just wanted to say, for all of you who come to Buffett events, you know how fantastically staged they are, and one of the people who is most responsible for that is May Malone, who's right here. So